Have you ever heard of all the missing tanks from World War II? Some say they were scrapped, others say buried, but what if something else happened to them? In this video, I'm going to make a diorama of a tank getting abducted by aliens. I'm going to attempt to make it float, using a technique that almost appears to defy gravity. That is, if you can actually get it to work. I hope you enjoy. This video is sponsored by KiwiCo. My inspiration for this diorama came from a few places. I was gifted this tank kit a while back and it's been begging to be used in a project, but until now I didn't have the creative ingredients that I needed to do something with it. Inspiration comes in many forms, and for this project it came in the form of a floating lamp, but I'll tell you more about that in a minute. After removing the runners from their bags, I opened up the instructions and I tried to interpret this infographic without reading any of the words on the page. I have no idea what it means. If you enjoy other scale modeling content, you'll probably recognize that I wasn't classically trained in the ways of fine scale modeling. As an example, I almost never paint in subassembly. Pretty much all the methods that I use for building scale models were learned by trial and error or from watching wargaming content. I can hear all the fine scale modelers in the comments.
Okay, Captain Obvious, tell us something we don't know.
That being said, a few of the channels I've gotten into that I almost never miss now are Night Shift and Laser Creation World, which has grown my desire to increase the realism of my dioramas. Hence, today's video. Nah, but jokes aside, what that looks like is just taking little steps here and there toward finer detail in my work. I've tried to do the same thing with my mini painting, and eventually, I think it'll pay off. I could probably count on one hand the number of tanks that I've assembled, and I always wonder why I don't do more. Because tanks are pretty cool. The one thing, though, about historical models that probably is the most intimidating thing to me is the fact that they come with so many variations and options, which is a double-edged sword. On one hand, think of the possibilities. On the other, think of the implications of using the wrong pieces. One incorrect armor plate or decal option could put your tank in a completely incorrect year or manufacturing location. Historical accuracy is nothing to take lightly. If I've learned anything from YouTube. Imagine the ridicule that would be directed towards someone for such a mistake. Honestly, it could crush a person. As I've dipped my toes in the historical modeling world, the roundabout way that I've shielded myself from such criticism is to include other things that are more incorrect or out of place. It's like throwing a flare to distract a T-Rex. Gotta divert attention in order to survive. As I worked my way through this assembly, I considered doing some upgrades like homemade rivets, photo-etched parts, or weld lines, and armor texture. But honestly, this Tamiya kit is detailed enough for this project. In the future, I might try my hand at some of those things, but that's for a later time. Incredibly, I didn't lose a single piece while squeezing it too hard with my tweezers this time, which is a rare thing for me. If I recorded and included all the time I spent crawling around on the floor looking for pieces in the past, I could easily double the length of most of my videos. With that, the tank assembly was done, and now I'll explain the second ingredient of this diorama. Back in September, I built this lamp from KiwiCo, which got me thinking, how could I use Tensegrity in a diorama? Saw this tank on the shelf and tried to look for an excuse for why it would be floating. An alien abduction came to mind. Like I said, that lamp came from KiwiCo, who are the kind sponsors of today's video. My son loves their toys. This truck, for instance, was an immediate favorite. One of the highlights of his week is when the real truck pulls up at the house and dumps the buckets. It was awesome to see him immediately make that connection with this one. KiwiCo does a great job making toys that encourage creativity, imagination, learning, and problem solving, which is exactly in line with what I want my son to get out of the things that he plays with. Oh, and of course, they're a lot of fun. Something my kiddo loves doing is helping around the house. Whether that's cleaning or cooking, he loves to participate. Giving him the ability to practice his participation and his counting at the same time has been great. And he's played with this toy for hours on end since we got it.
Happy birthday, Dama.
Can you blow out the candles? If you're looking for some good Christmas gifts to buy your kids, grandkids, or any kids for that matter, I would recommend KiwiCo. To give a little extra support to this channel, you can go to kiwico.com/boili or use the code BOILI at checkout for 50% off your first monthly crate. Big thank you to KiwiCo for sponsoring today's video. Along with the floating tank, I also needed a floating crew. Aliens wouldn't abduct an empty tank. Be like getting a Kinder Egg without a toy inside. The first guy was in mostly the correct position, but the second guy needed a little bit more unique of a pose that I didn't have on hand, so I'll need to do some customizing. I started with the torso and head that came with this set, and then combined others that I had lying around. With his new position, there was now a gap in his belly that needed to be filled with some putty. So warmed up his shins with a heat gun to bend those into a more natural position. Then I clipped and added some arms that looked more like they were holding on for dear life. After rotating the hands and gluing those new arms in place, it was time to blend all of the new parts together. And for that, I used Epoxy Sculpt, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. Once that had been smooshed into the gaps, I used a silicone sculpting tool to match the details that were already there. And then I left the putty to cure and moved over to another element that would help sell the idea that this thing was being abducted into the air by some aliens. These tow cables didn't look quite right, as stiff as they were, so I heated them up with a moderate amount of care over a heat gun, and I did some bending. The goal here was to add a nice amount of dimension to suggest that they were floating in a zero gravity, or almost zero gravity situation. This was a pretty delicate process, and I thought I had ruined it a couple times, but in the end I was happy with the results. I glued those cables, each with one end attached to an anchor point on the tank. And for one of the cables, I also included a little shovel, just to help elevate the floaty effect. Initially, I had thought about taking this lamp apart and using the components, but after looking at it for a little bit, I realized I could probably recreate it myself using my own fishing line. Stuff is extremely thin and barely visible, even if you're not a fish. I decided to wait on getting this thing set up in its floating position until after it had been painted, so I took it outside to prime. I also prepped the crew members by getting them on some painting handles. I made sure that they were in the same orientation that they will be seen in when the diorama is done. And the reason for that is so that the lighting is consistent across all the minis. To increase the efficiency of my time, I decided to start working on the base so that that could be drying while I painted the minis. Acrylic doesn't have the best grip on Sculptamold, so I added an in-between layer of some corkboard. After shaving off the excess corkboard, I broke out the Sculptamold. This is what I'm going to use to build up the ground texture. To make the Sculptamold a little less moist and cut down on the dry time, I added a little less water. I kneaded that into a little sticky ball, and I spread that over the base. After all the corkboard was covered, I smoothed out the Sculptamold a little bit with my finger and cleaned up those sides. And then I spread some cling film over top to try and impress the tread marks. Unfortunately, the thickness of the Sculptamold came back to bite me here, and those were basically not visible at all. So I'll figure out a way to compensate later. While the Sculptamold was drying, it was time to bring back those primed minis and begin the painting. The first step in the painting process was to give the tank a coat of brown, which I sprayed loosely over all of the panels, avoiding full coverage at all the seam lines and crevices. By avoiding those areas and keeping them nice and dark, you can begin to establish a pre-shade, which helps distinguish different parts of the vehicle from each other. I applied that same brown to the lower half of the tank, and the next step was to apply a chipping medium. What this will allow me to do is to create some easy and nice realistic looking weathering a little later on in the process. After the chipping medium had time to dry fully, I went back over top with my primary color of the tank, which is a light gray. In multiple of my projects, I've placed World War II Soviet soldiers, and now this Soviet tank, in funny and unrealistic situations. Hasn't been an intentional choice. I'm trying to pick on the Soviets or anything like that. But they've just been in the right poses and either in stock at my local hobby store or gifted to me, like in this case. I wasn't going for totally destroyed or abandoned, so I had to be quite gentle because it's easy to overdo that chipping process. With the chipping done, I could then move on to the other weathering effects, starting with some black and brown panel liners. Cleaned those up and blended them with some mineral spirits, and after that had had some time to dry, I picked out some individual spots on the tank that looked like they could use some highlights with a detail brush. From there, I worked my way around the tank, picking out the other details, like the tow cables and the fuel cans and the folded tarps. After the brush work was done, and the tank was in a place I was content with, I moved over to the men, who got a pretty straightforward paint job as well. I used a two-tone zenithal highlight to establish the base coats of their uniforms, followed by a thinned down warm yellow glaze, which tinted the uniforms to a more accurate hue that I saw on the box. Not that accuracy even matters at this point, however, because they are being lifted in the air by a UFO. To quickly get some shading back in those recesses, I gave the figures brown pin wash followed by their highlights. Originally, the plan was to add a UFO to the scene itself, but as I was working on this, I thought it would be more fun to just imply it using the lighting. So, you'll see what that looks like in the end results. Eventually, I'll put it on a shelf with some fun overhead lighting, but if you were wondering why there's no UFO, that's the reason. After the character minis, I returned back to the lower half of the tank because I had forgotten to add some weathering to those treads. I mixed up some pigment powders with water and spread that over the tracks. I did go back off camera with more pure water to dial that back to a more natural look. And then the last thing to add before moving on to the base were the water decals on the turret. After thinking it over for a bit, I couldn't think of a more appropriate number to put on the side of a tank that was found in this situation. I scratched up the decals to blend them into the paint job a little better, and then I took the whole thing outside for a protective coat of matte varnish. After that, I glued the tank crew in place. With that, the work on the tank was done and it was time to move on to the base, which by this point was nice and dry. I took that outside and primed it matte black, but I realized that I need to have the stand position figured out before I can start painting. To make the pieces required for the Tensegrity to work, and keep things invisible as possible, I used some acrylic, which is also strong enough to handle the weight without bending or breaking. Once I had cut those pieces out on the bandsaw, I figured out their positioning and I glued the smaller one to the bottom of the tank. I drilled some holes for some rods, which will add extra strength to that piece at the bottom, and I was careful not to attach this using normal superglue. I used foam-safe superglue instead, which does not cloud up acrylic. I carefully drilled some holes through the acrylic just large enough for the fishing line. I did the same thing on the larger hook, which will be lodged in the base. I made an impression where that needed to be and cut through all the way to the acrylic underneath. I'll be attaching these pieces together using Weld-On 3, so I did need acrylic exposed all the way at the bottom. From there, it was time to paint the base. I gave the earth a coat of earthy brown and was contemplating giving the base more of a deserty look. I actually did more than contemplate. I covered the whole thing in pigment powders, fully intending for it to be deserty. And I didn't really like the way it looked, so I pivoted. And once it was fully dry, I took it outside and gave it a clear coat of gloss varnish, which makes it look a little bit more like soil, on top of which I added my static tack and static grass. My little way of compensating for those lost tread marks was to cover everything but the tread marks in grass. And it definitely doesn't look professional, but it's something. I tinted the grass with a couple spots of darker green just to give it a little bit more variation, and it was time to move back to the acrylic. At this point, it was just a matter of tying the fishing line together in a way that wouldn't unravel. Now that I'm looking at this, I probably should have mounted the tank at a slightly less steep angle. The whole point of the Tensegrity is so you can kind of see it and wonder how it's defying gravity. But I probably could have gotten this same effect just using a clear acrylic standoff. That's okay. This isn't the last time I intend to use Tensegrity. To get the rest of the fishing line to hold in place, I used screws, which was partially a good idea. It allowed me to easily set the line at just the right length, but one downside was that if the line wasn't seated correctly, the screw wouldn't just pinch it, but it would actually cut the line entirely. It happened a few times, which caused me a little bit of frustration, and I had to redo segments of this over and over, but I did finally get it sorted out with some trial and error. With the lower half of the tank now floating, the last things to do were to put the top of the tank back in place and paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons, and another special thank you to KiwiCo for sponsoring today's video. Hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next time.